Chapter 9. A Dash for Freedom. Doom stared at us in that instant as the serpent creatures rushed down the great corridor toward us. For well we knew that never could we win our way down the long street to our waiting ship with that pursuit behind us. For a flashing moment as we stood there, stunned, it seemed that recapture was inevitable. And then as a sudden thought flared across my brain, I cried out to my companions. "Get out of the building!" I cried. "I can hold them here!" They hesitated and then sprang down the corridor toward the street, while at the same instant I leapt into the great museum hall from which we had just emerged. With a single bound, I had grasped the needle and tube of restorative red fluid and was at the great transparent cases, ripping the sides open frantically and stabbing the needle with lightning swiftness into their occupants. Those in a dozen or more cases I had swiftly treated thus before I dropped the tube and needle and leapt back to the door into the corridor. As I did so, I had seen the first of the strange, terrible shapes I had touched with the needle beginning to stir, to move from their bases. As I sprang back out into the corridor, though, the racing masses of the serpent creatures were but a scant 100 feet behind me, my own companions racing out of the building ahead of me now. The serpent things loosed no rays upon us, desiring, I knew, to return us to that hell of living death from which we had escaped. But as I sprang down the corridor, they were so close behind that another moment, I knew, would see my capture in that of my friends ahead. Then, just as the serpent creatures, racing behind me, reached the door of the museum, they halted, recoiled, for out into the corridor from that museum hall had flopped a great, terrible shape, the mighty disc of pale flesh, with a single central eye that my needle had been first to revive. Instantly it had moved upon the serpent creatures, upon whom its glaring eye fell, and before they could escape had thrown its vast disc of flesh about a mass of scores of them, bunching its body swiftly together then with terrific power and crushing them within it. At another mass of them it leapt, ravening with terrific fury after its imprisonment of untold ages of living death. While out of the museum there came after it the other shapes I had revived, awful insect beings that leapt upon the serpent creatures with terrible claws and fangs, heedless of the death beams that flashed toward them, many-limbed things of flesh that whirled forward as fiercely to the attack, grotesque, terrible monsters of a dozen different sorts that leapt now upon the serpent creatures who had prisoned them for ages with inconceivable raging power, heaping about them great masses of crushed and mangled serpent dead. Only in a glance over my shoulder did I glimpse that massacre of the serpent creatures behind me, for I was racing on down the corridor and out of the building into the narrow street, where my friends awaited me. With a word I explained to them what had happened, and instantly we set off down the street, between the great towering buildings of beaming blue force that lay silent and dead now in the dusky darkness, only their own flickering light and that of the vast, dim red sun that swung in the black heavens above, lighting us forward as we raced on. Behind, though, in the great building from which we had fled, were rising appalling cries, the hissing utterances of the serpent creatures, and the strange and awful cries of the things with which they battled. Now about us were rising other cries, as the serpent creatures across all the city began to rouse beneath the terrific din of the wild fight in the central building. Behind us, as we raced on down the narrow street, we saw them emerging from the buildings, gazing about, and then as we were glimpsed, fleeing toward the landing, circle where lay the ships. Other cries went up, and after us leapt the serpent things from all along the street, pouring into that street from its buildings and from adjacent streets and racing after us. But a few hundred yards ahead lay the landing circle, and as we ran on, we could make out the gleaming great shapes of the oval ships lying upon it, could discern the shape of our own awaiting ship. At the circle's edge, its door opened before us. Toward that black opening, as towards some tremendous magnet, we stumbled on with the last of our strength. But close behind came the serpent creatures in ever-increasing masses, the alarm spreading now over all the gigantic city about us. And there lay still a distance that seemed infinite between us and that open door. Then, when we were but a scant 100 feet from it, the serpent creatures hardly more than that behind us, Chorus Khan slipped, stumbled, and went down. We wheeled around, reaching down to help him up, but halted even as we did so, for the serpent creatures behind us were within yards of us now, hissing cries of triumph rising from them as they writhed toward us. Then, in the next moment, from the great, looming bulk of our ship ahead, there stabbed down and over us a shaft of blinding crimson light, a narrow, deadly ray that struck the writhing masses of our pursuers and swept through them in a great, slicing curve, sending them into annihilation in dazzling bursts of light as it touched them. Those farther behind came racing on, nevertheless. But before they could reach us, we had stumbled on and into the ship, and with space doors clanging and generators suddenly droning loudly, our ship shot up into the darkness, just in time to escape a dozen pale death beams that sprang toward us from the mass of our pursuers. Up into the darkness above the vast, blue-glowing city we flashed, Chuldeen and Chorus Khan and I bursting up into the pilot room and replacing our follower there, whose timely action had saved us. Beneath us, the whole city was rising as the alarm spread, lights flashing out here and there among its buildings, serpent hordes pouring into the streets, while from the landing circle from which we had just risen, there shot up after us a dozen long gleaming oval ships in close pursuit. So swiftly were they after us that before we had fully realized their nearness, their death beams were sweeping and slicing through the darkness about us. I shouted a swift order. Chorus Khan whirled the controls about and sent our ship flashing straight back into the mass of our dozen pursuers. And then we had leapt through them, our red rays striking right and left as we did so, and two of their great craft had flared there in the darkness above the great city in blinding crimson light. And we were racing up into the darkness again with the 10 remaining ships farther behind, but still speeding on our track. Upward we shot with terrific speed, and in a moment the vast turning world beneath, covered with the masses of blue force structures, had contracted and dwindled to a mere point beneath us as we fled up and outward into space. As we flashed up from it, though, I had glimpsed rising from it a full 500 serpent ships, with a score of the great disc attraction ships. And as these lifted to follow the 10 that leapt close behind us, I saw that the serpent creatures were taking no slightest chance of our escape. I turned to Chorus Khan swiftly as our craft leapt upward, shouting to him above the droning roar of the generators that filled our craft now. Head straight out toward the great vibration wall, toward the opening in it, I cried. We'll never get through that opening between the space forts, Chuldeen exclaimed. They'll have received word of our escape and will be waiting for us. I shook my head. We'll have to run between them and take our chance, I yelled. It's our one chance of escape from this universe. Now the giant central world beneath was no longer visible as we raced upward and outward from it at terrific speed, and ahead loomed one of the 3 giant suns that lay about that world. We were leaping forward straight toward it, and in an instant it had broadened across the heavens to a stupendous disk of raging crimson fire, a thunderous, titanic sun into which we seemed inevitably doomed to plunge. But as it flared across the firmament before us, Chorus Khan swerved the controls, and we were flashing by it, past the red star's edge, and on outward through the dying universe. Traveling at a speed that was all but suicidal to use inside any universe, thrumming on at all but our utmost velocity, we reeled outward through the throngs of dead and dying stars about us, while behind us at a speed that matched our own, our 10 pursuers came relentlessly on, with the 500-odd ships that we had seen rising from the Serpent City following us in turn. Out. The minutes of that mad outward flight through the dying universe are but a confused, strange memory of a wild, awful race through the massed, dead and dying stars that thronged thick about us, and between which we drove with such terrific swiftness that hardly could we glimpse them in passing, save on our space chart. On that chart, I saw a closed-mass cluster of dark suns full before us, saw the Antarians swing the ship lightning-like, sidewise to avoid it, then sharply drive the controls back again as before us a crimson flaming star about which turned countless worlds of the serpent people loomed before us. Out, out, flashing crazily on past crimson sun and thundering dark star, through the massed suns of great dead and dying clusters, and past far-swinging planets, with the 10 long ships behind clinging remorselessly to us. Out, out, until far ahead there became visible across all the heavens before us the wavering pale blue tight of the great vibration wall that encircled this universe. Out between the last of the dying universe's dark and dying suns we were racing toward that mighty wall, and as we leapt forward I pointed toward it. "The space forts," I exclaimed. "Make for the opening between them, Chorus Khan, and slacken speed a little." Straight toward the 2 great metal structures set in the pale blue shining wall we leapt. 2 huge fortresses of gleaming metal from whose narrow openings came brilliant white light, whose mighty death beam tubes swung threateningly out toward the space between them, the single vibrationless opening in the vast and impenetrable vibration wall. They had been warned, were ready for us. We knew, and knew too that not even by a miracle could our ship run between those towering forts without coming under the deadly beams. Yet still toward them we leapt, at a speed slackened a little. Now, while after us like leaping things of prey, came the 10 ships rapidly overhauling us, flashing closer each moment. We had almost reached the great opening in the wall now, the 10 ships behind almost upon us. And as we flashed through space, the whole scene was like one from some weird dream. The thronging dark and dying suns of the great universe behind us. The tremendous, all but invisible, pale blue wall of light that enclosed it. The single opening in that wall full before us, guarded on either side by the mighty metal space forts. The great ships leaping after us just behind. We were flashing into the narrow opening. From the great space forts to right and left, the deadly death beams were stabbing out toward us in scores, in hundreds. The ships behind were almost upon us, their own death beams stabbing toward us. And then I cried a single word to Chorus Khan. He thrust the controls suddenly forward with a lightning-like move, and just as our ship was flashing into the narrow opening, it dipped sharply downward instead and plummeted down through space, while the ships just behind, before they could dip with us, had rushed into the opening and into the hell of death beams that crossed and recrossed in it from the space forts on each side. The next instant, while we curved swiftly upward again, we saw the 10 ships that had rushed into that opening whirling blindly about as the death beams from their own space forts seared through them and wiped out all life inside them. Those in the great space forts, realizing those 10 to be their own ships, had turned off the beams in the next moment, but were an instant too late, since in the narrow opening, the 10 ships were whirling crazily to that side, and this without guiding intelligence inside them, smashing into each other and into the space forts on each side as they rushed insanely in all directions. And even as that wild confusion inside the opening was at its height, our own ship had curved up and was flashing at full speed into the opening, between the space forts. For an instant, in that wild chaos of whirling ships, those in the space forts did not glimpse our own flying ship. And in that instant, we were half through the great opening between them. Then they had seen us, had loosed their beams upon us in scores, and in the next instant, all about us seemed a single tremendous melee of aimlessly whirling ships and gigantic space forts and pale death beams that sliced and swept about us. Thick about us flashed those ghostly fingers of death, and full before us 2 of the whirling ships collided and smashed with terrific force. Then Chorus Khan had dodged them by a swift shifting of the controls. Our generators roared suddenly louder as he turned on our utmost speed, and the crazy chaos of ships and beams and forts about us had suddenly vanished, replaced by darkness and silence unutterable. We were through, were racing out into the void again with the great vibration wall and the dying universe it enclosed, and the pursuing serpent ships inside it dropping farther behind each moment. In the blackness that encircled us, the dying universe was a far-flung, dwindling glow behind us, and our own a far patch of misty light to the left. But there shone in the darkness far ahead a misty disk of radiant light, and it was toward this that our ship was heading. For we were flashing out again upon our interrupted mission. We're flying out through the awful gulf of outer space once more toward the Andromeda universe.